Yes, welcome to this new session on globalization. In this session, we would look at the third world perspective of globalization. Rather, it is a third world critique of globalization. Because as we discussed in the previous segment, that globalization is global common sense. It is very much in the world, it's very fashionable. It is very acceptable. So it is very difficult for anybody to look at globalization critically in the present times. Although some scholars have written critically about globalization and there are critiques of globalization, but usually in the public sphere we find that globalization has established itself as a common sense at the global level. Countries of the world are competing with each other to globalize as fast as they could. In any country of the world, usually the debate is not whether we need to globalize or not, the debate is on how to globalize. That shows that we, especially in the third world, have been made to understand that there is no option but globalization. So you have to globalize. Now the only option before you is to decide how to globalize, whether to run towards it or to go slowly towards it or take your time, but eventually you have to globalize. So that is again something which is of concern, where a value has come before us in the last few decades, and today it is looming over all of us in the world, especially in the third world, and we are being asked to decide not to whether we accept it or not, but to decide how to implement it, how to involve yourself in this, how to go into it. So you have virtually no choice. So something which is coming from outside and of which we don't have any choice, we need to look at it very critically. To my understanding, globalization is actually a consequence of the desire of the Western world to continue its domination in the non-Western world, which in earlier times they were doing through different means, and immediately before this phenomena, before the Second World War, they used to do it through colonialism and imperialism. So till that time of colonialism and imperialism, the use of force was fashionable in international politics. So it was all right that if you had the power, if you had the capacity, if you had the military strength, you could do whatever you liked. And that's what the colonial powers, the erstwhile colonial powers did. They went in different countries of the world, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, colonized them, plundered their wealth, and left, when they were sometimes forced to leave, and sometimes when they decided that it was enough and they did not need more, so they went back to their own countries. So at that time, force was fashionable in international politics. You could use force and you could be proud of that because you were powerful. Of course, force is used even today. But after the horrors of the Second World War, somehow in the world it was understood that this kind of forcible occupation of countries is something which is not good. And therefore, colonialism and imperialism slowly went out of fashion. So although these instrumentalities by which the Western countries were colonizing the other countries of the non-West and plundering their wealth, although these instrumentalities went out of fashion, but their desire, their greed, and their urge to control these countries and exploit them did not go off. They still needed to plunder these countries, exploit these countries, control their resources, but they could not use force so blatantly and openly as they were using till that time. So they had to devise some other operational mechanism to control and dominate over these countries. And that mechanism should flow out of consent. Means, in other words, that you can now no more control these people by using force, but you now decided a new instrumentality by which you decided to control them by taking their own consent. And that was, of course, not an easy task. So globalization actually, to my mind, came out of this urge, this desire. And therefore they created a new term, globalization. And that term had to gain legitimacy in the world, because colonialism and imperialism had gone out of currency, they had got delegitimized, and they were out of fashion. So globalization was advertised and glamorized excessively over several decades, and slowly and gradually it came to occupy that place of global common sense in the world. Repeatedly it was impressed upon people of the world everywhere that this is something, which will solve all your problems. So globalization, to my mind, was basically a consequence of this urge of the Western world to dominate over the non-Western world. And globalization was to be used as an instrument of that control or domination. Although it was required to create the consent in these countries so that they never required to use force, to control these countries. And the first steps in that direction had already been taken even before globalization became a very popular term in the international arena. And that happened immediately after the Second World War, when three important institutions were created by the Western world under the leadership of the United States of America. And they were the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Now of course, they had very stated objectives, But practically, these institutions were created in a manner to ensure that the Western world led by America could eventually come to control the economies and systems of the non-Western world by using these institutions, by using these instrumentalities where they did not have to use force, but these institutions will operate in a manner that eventually the third world countries would have very little option but to listen to what they were saying, because these were institutions which were giving them resources, loans, money, and then the GATT, which was framing rules and regulations for international trade and tariff and commerce. So the broad idea behind that was that the Western world decided to use law as an important instrument of control. Because law is something which is very intriguing in this context. Like, for example, common people like us, whenever any new issue comes even in the country, we often talk about that issue. And if there is something in the air that a new law is coming on some issue, we start talking about it, and some people are very agitated that this is a very obnoxious idea and this is something very bad. And how can that kind of a law be made? We have all kinds of opinions. But eventually when that law is made, most of us go silent, We immediately start obeying that particular thing, conforming to the law. Although the law is trying to legitimize the same idea which we were opposing earlier. But the moment it is enacted into a law, it gives legitimacy to that idea. And the moment an idea gets legitimacy, it becomes easy for us to follow that idea. So that is the beauty of law, if you may call it like that. So that is what was realized by America and its allies at the global level. And they decided to control this lawmaking mechanism in the world and to regulate it, because they were in a position, they were powerful, they were rich, they had the resources. So the institutions which I mentioned were created, and many others were created after them. The basic purpose was to create these institutions, and since they had created those institutions, the laws, the rules, the regulations on which and through which these institutions would operate would obviously be created by them. So through those laws of these institutions, through the mechanism and through the institutions, they would control these countries of the world and not use brute force only to bring them to what they wanted them to do. So if For example, they wanted the third world countries to open up their economies. They would not go and ask them to open up their economies so that they could enter these economies and to control them and exploit them and suck their resources. They would create these financial institutions in the world, and these poor third world countries obviously will go begging for money. And when they'll go to these international financial institutions, there would be conditions known as conditionalities. And these conditionalities would relate to not only their economies, but even sometimes their polities, that what kind of openness should be there in the economy, how foreign investment has to be rather invited in those countries, how foreign companies have to be allowed to come in, what are the economic reforms which that country should undertake, what are the say political reforms which that country has to undertake, and all kinds of conditions would be there. Since these countries were poor, they needed a lot of money and resources. They had no option but to agree to these conditions, obviously. So the thing which these countries would have resisted otherwise, because now they were sovereign, independent countries. They were not the colonies of the erstwhile colonial powers. So now they were free to take their own decisions. But these institutions would eventually, create situations whereby these countries would not have much of an option but to agree to the conditions. And after a few years, many of these countries would be in a debt trap. They would not be able to repay even the interest to the loans which they had taken. And once they were in debt traps, they would be much more vulnerable to accept the conditions which were imposed on them by the international financial institutions. So the basic idea here was to create consent or to force these countries or to arm twist them through these institutions to listen to what the Western world wanted. So this was an instrument where the force or coercion is not being used directly, but there are institutions or instruments which are creating such conditions where it becomes very difficult for these third world countries to ignore the directions which are coming from the other side. So that is how law was used as a very important instrument to control these countries and to ensure that they did exactly what the erstwhile colonial masters wanted them to do in the new world. Then, other than this, there was the instrument of knowledge also, which was very important because knowledge is something which creates ideas in our minds. New ideas germinate in our mind as a result of the knowledge we keep on acquiring. And the ideas which usually would germinate in our minds are dependent on the knowledge which we absorb. But if somebody was to control that knowledge or manipulate that knowledge which is coming to our minds, that entity can control to a great extent what we think. So our thought processes can be controlled by the people who are gatekeepers of knowledge which is reaching us. Although it is a very ambitious project, if somebody were to decide to control the knowledge which enters our minds, but suppose it is done, it is something which is very dangerous. And it was exactly this what the Western world came out doing. They realized that the best universities and the best research institutions in all fields of knowledge are located in the West. They were there at that time and even today they are there. So they decided now that knowledge production will not only be for knowledge's sake, as it generally was till that time. So now knowledge will be produced keeping in mind our economic, political and strategic interests. So knowledge will not be inconsistent, or knowledge production henceforth will not be inconsistent with our interests in this area. So knowledge production did not remain innocent after that period, in fact, whereby it was dependent upon their economic, political and strategic interests. And therefore, they decided to have the production of knowledge in a manner which would take into account their interests also. Because they decided that if knowledge is uninhibited by these factors, then maybe knowledge is created in a manner which goes against our interests. So we would be the main producers of knowledge, and that knowledge would be used against us. So that is something which is not desirable. So now both have to come together. The knowledge production has to be consistent with our economic, political and strategic interests. And therefore, if one looks at how knowledge was produced or has been produced since then, one realizes that it is very much, or it has been very much consistent with their interests. Certain cases are very, very clear, if you look at them, one would understand, how knowledge production has taken into account the interests of the Western multinational corporations or the Western world generally in different areas. And how that same knowledge is used to control things, which the third world countries would be doing or would try to do as a consequence of being of absorbing the very knowledge which they had created. To make this point more clear, I'll give you an example. For example, in the World Trade Organization, a few years back, there was a controversy in the World Trade Organization about Indian carpets. Now, World Trade Organization usually claims that it is a globalized world, it is a free world, so there is a free trade and there should be no restriction in trade, and state actors and other actors in the international system should put no restrictions in trade. It should be open because they know that in matters of manufactured goods, they are having better science and technology, research and development structures, so their goods are bound to be better and the whole world is going to buy them, and that's exactly what is happening. But sometimes, even according to rules framed by them, they sometimes are at a disadvantage, as it happened in this particular case. So, there was a point when the Indian hand-woven carpets, were in great demand at the global level in the international market. And the carpet manufacturers in the West were seeing that their carpets had very little takers because they were all machine made. So according to the rules framed by them, it was the choice of the consumers. If people are buying more the hand-woven carpets coming from India and several other countries, it's fine. The consumer should have their choice, but no. They were not ready to tolerate this. So what they said was that they went and invoked the human rights clause. Now, human rights is an idea which has been popularized and developed by the Western world. And we got that knowledge of human rights in the modern world and how human rights evolved and the discourses of human rights basically from the Western world. But now you see how the same knowledge is being used against us. They invoked the human rights clause in the World Trade Organization. And they said that these carpets are made in factories and establishments where children and women labor is being exploited, because they knew that in India, which is a developing country, a lot of women and children are employed in many factories and industries, despite the fact that legally it is not allowed, but nevertheless it happens because the unorganized sector is so huge and people are so poor that they have no option but to go and work. And these women and children, they are in the unorganized sector and they don't have that bargaining capacity. So they charge less than what men would charge. So there is a tendency among all factory owners to employ more women and children, and the same is true in the carpet industry. So the argument went like this, that since it was the exploitation of women and children in making these carpets, so there is human rights violation. And the allegation was that these carpets are splattered with the blood of women and children. And eventually, that disqualification clause was invoked. That since you can't beat us in the game, so what you do is that try to disqualify me and put me out of the game by using this human rights clause. So that human rights clause would also be invoked very selectively. So we would not be in a position usually to invoke the same clause on them, on many other issues, but they are They have got more financial and economic muscle, and so therefore they can use that clause in the World Trade Organization and pressurize us and push us out of the market where they cannot compete with us in an open market. So one can see, how knowledge is produced and how it is selectively used to dominate over us or control us, and it happens in a variety of ways. There could be hundreds of examples of areas, of rather fields where the knowledge is produced very selectively, and it is used very cleverly to ensure that the interests of the Western world, especially the multinational corporations stationed in the West, are protected. Similarly, they would use the media. Now, media is something, which is softener of the mind. As we were discussing in the previous segment, that how Western values are globalized under the slogan of universalization of values. So now here media is used as a softener of the mind, because usually, when people living in the non-Western world, whenever a new idea would come from the West, we would generally be not very receptive. Normally, we're not receptive to that idea. But when our minds are softened by the incessant bombing of information, which is coming from the Western world through the media, through the soap operas of the West, through the television programs, and through all kinds of channels of communication, which are 24 hours bombarding our minds with the information. Not only the information, but the glamorization of information, which comes from the West. So that softens our mind. We are all positively inclined towards ideas which are coming from the West. We are all having a propensity to easily accept things which come from that side, because that whole world is glamorized so much before our eyes and minds that despite the fact that most of us have not been there, have not seen the Western world, but the image of the Western world is so very attractive in our minds. So therefore, whenever any idea comes from that side, it is easy for us to lap up that idea and internalize it, because it is obviously good. So anything which comes from our cultures or our societies is not very nice, but anything which comes from the other side is very nice, because that superiority of their idea, of their culture, of their values, of their worldview is established in the mind because of that incessant bombing of glamorization of those things which are coming from the other side. So that creates a very favorable situation in all our minds to accept those ideas and to consent to things which are coming from the other side. So the basic idea here was, as I mentioned when we started this critique, that the basic idea was to create consent in our minds, to consent to things which are coming from the other side. And the media is the final softener of the mind, which softens our mind and makes it more receptive to ideas which are coming from that side. And that makes their task all the more easy. So this is how globalization, to my understanding, is also a phenomenon which is basically intended at controlling, subjugating, and economically exploiting the erstwhile colonial countries of the world. Because eventually, global capitalism basically wants to accumulate wealth at the core. And globalization is the most pervasive, useful instrument of global capitalism in the modern world to ensure that the wealth from all around the world slowly but surely moves to the core countries, eventually leading to their getting richer and richer at the cost of our poor third world countries, which are getting poorer and poorer every day. So that is basically the other side of globalization, which we in the third world need to understand. Although the critical dimension was sometimes overstated by me, but that was basically to bring that point home, that how globalization has such kinds of objectives, which basically intend at the further immiseration of the countries of the global south. Thank you.